My wife came home very late every day until I found out she was cheating on me with her boss. When Emily and I first married, everything felt aligned. We were one of those couples who seemed to just fit. We shared an apartment, dreams of traveling, and talked late into the night about the kind of life we wanted to build together. She had a drive that matched my own, an intelligence that pulled me toward her every day. And so when her career took off, I was thrilled for her. She'd put years of work into getting to this point, so why wouldn't I be? It started small, as changes often do. A few late nights, she said, were just part of the promotion she'd gotten. New clients, new accounts, new emergencies that needed immediate attention. She'd text that she was stuck at work or mention she had to finish a pitch over dinner with her boss, Richard. She said his name offhandedly, but over time, I noticed she began to say it more. First with the occasional nod of respect, but soon with something that bordered on admiration. It sounded innocent enough, and I chalked it up to her simply being impressed with someone in her field. After all, she'd been longing for a mentor, and maybe he was it. I couldn't help but notice that our life together started to feel increasingly quiet in her absence. I'd come home to an empty apartment, the same leftovers in the fridge, her laptop still open on the couch where she'd left it the previous night. On weekends, she'd sometimes be too tired to go out or would scroll on her phone late at night, answering messages that she said just couldn't wait. I'd offer to cook or to take her out, trying to coax her back into our world, but she'd always brush it off, saying she was too exhausted. I didn't want to be the jealous husband. I wanted to be the understanding one, the man who supported his wife's dreams. But as the days turned into weeks, the late nights became more frequent. It was rare for Emily to be home before 10, sometimes 11, and she always seemed restless, anxious, almost preoccupied. She'd dress up a little more each day, apply lipstick, add accessories she'd never bothered with before. When I asked if everything was all right, she'd say, "Just work stress," or "I've got a lot on my plate." I tried to be there for her in all the ways I could, but slowly, our connection became frayed, barely held together by occasional glances and superficial words. One evening, after she texted to say she'd be home late as usual, I decided to wait up for her. Midnight ticked by, then 1, then 2 in the morning. When she finally came through the door, I saw her struggle to compose herself. Her hair was mussed, and her blouse was buttoned unevenly. I felt an ache in my chest, something like an alarm going off in my mind. When I asked where she'd been, she simply shrugged and mumbled, "Finishing a client dinner." It went longer than I thought. She went straight to bed, leaving me staring at her from the doorway, a strange feeling gnawing at me, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her. I didn't want to face what I was beginning to suspect. The next day, I sat at my desk, unable to focus. Her image burned into my mind. After debating with myself for hours, I decided to find out the truth. The following morning, I told her I was working late too, but instead, I parked a few streets down from her office building and waited. I felt like a stranger to myself, sitting there like some kind of voyeur, but I had to know. Minutes turned to hours until finally, I saw her walk out of the office around 7 p.m., laughing with Richard, her boss. They were walking closely, not quite touching, but there was an energy between them that twisted my stomach. I followed them to a bar nearby, where they slipped into a corner booth. They were seated side by side, heads bent close, laughing and exchanging looks that seemed anything but professional. I watched them from the street, my view partially obstructed, but what I saw was more than enough. After their drinks, they stood, her arm casually slipping around his waist as he guided her out. I wanted to rush in, to confront them, but my body felt numb, paralyzed by the truth. They walked to a small hotel nearby, and when they went inside, I felt the last threads of my denial snap. The image of them together was burned into my mind as I drove home, feeling like I was sinking. I don't remember much of that night except sitting on our couch in the dark, the silence around me louder than anything I'd ever heard. When Emily came home late again that night, she found me sitting in the dimly lit living room, waiting. She seemed startled to see me there, and I could tell she knew. Without preamble, I asked her directly if she was involved with Richard. For a moment, she looked at me, her eyes filled with something unreadable, then her gaze dropped, and she nodded. Her voice was barely a whisper as she said, "Yes." The truth poured out in fragments, each word chipping away at everything we'd built together. She admitted she'd felt something missing in her life, and that somehow, in her mind, Richard had filled that void. She'd fallen for the excitement, the allure of something forbidden, a rush that our marriage had lost over the years. She tried to explain, as if there were words that could make sense of the betrayal. We talked through the night, laying bare everything we both left unsaid for so long. I told her about the pain, the loneliness I'd felt as I watched her drift further and further away. She admitted that she'd known but had chosen to ignore it, consumed by her own needs and justifications. By dawn, the exhaustion was so thick between us that we couldn't speak another word. We decided to take some time apart. In the days that followed, our home became a shell, a place we moved through like strangers, each of us haunted by the things we'd shared that night. The air felt thick with the weight of what was left unspoken, even after we'd torn down every wall between us. It was like we'd exposed all of our flaws, all of the quiet grievances and unmet needs, but the act of bringing it all to the surface had left us depleted, hollow. Emily stayed with her sister, leaving me alone in the apartment we'd built together. The silence was unbearable, the kind that seemed to stretch through every room. I kept expecting to hear her laugh in the kitchen or see her shoes tossed carelessly in the hallway. The memories of our life were everywhere, like shadows that refused to fade. At first, I couldn't bring myself to touch her things. Her favorite mug sat on the counter, lipstick stained and still half full of the last coffee she'd made here. Her books lined our shelves, all the ones she'd promised to read but never found the time for. I caught myself imagining she might walk through the door at any moment, as if everything that had happened was just a nightmare I'd wake from. The ache was constant, like a dull throb that settled into my bones. I threw myself into work, long hours and endless tasks to keep my mind busy. But when I came home at night, the silence greeted me like an old friend, and I found myself sinking into memories I wasn't ready to face. I replayed our last few months together, searching for the exact moment we'd lost each other. I wondered if it was my fault, if I'd become too complacent, too wrapped up in my own life to notice her slipping away. Friends tried to help, tried to coax me out with dinners or drinks, but I turned them down more often than not. I needed time to understand myself, to face what I'd lost and what I'd still clung to in vain. And maybe a part of me wanted to feel the full weight of it, to let the pain serve as a reminder of the cost of neglect, of taking things for granted. Emily and I met once a week during that period, exchanging brief updates about work, about the mundane details of our days. Each meeting felt like a test of sorts, a reminder of the person I once knew so well and was now seeing through a stranger's eyes. We were civil, careful not to slip into accusations or apologies, but I could see the hurt in her eyes, the guilt that lingered even when we both tried to move past it. A month into our separation, I received an unexpected email. It was from a job I'd applied for years ago, back when Emily and I had first started dating, a position in another city that I'd let go of for the stability of staying close to home. They were hiring again and wondered if I might be interested in revisiting the opportunity. The timing felt uncanny, almost like life was offering me an out, a fresh start in a place where I could escape the weight of everything that had happened. I sat with the offer for days, unsure of what it meant. Moving meant letting go, not just of our apartment but of the life we'd built, of every piece of the identity I'd created with her. It would mean leaving behind the places we'd shared, the people we'd grown close to, and everything that had defined us. But staying meant living in the shadow of our past, of a life that had crumbled, a relationship that had been held together by illusions. Finally, I called Emily. We hadn't spoken since our last coffee a week prior, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice when she picked up. I told her about the job offer, about how conflicted I felt. I half expected her to ask me to stay, to suggest we try again. But she didn't. Instead, she took a breath and said, "Maybe this is what we both need." Her voice was calm, steady, as if she'd already accepted it. "We can't go back, and I think we both know that. Maybe it's time we see who we are without each other." Her words were hard to hear, but I knew she was right. I had spent so much of my life with her that I'd forgotten who I was alone, forgotten the dreams I'd shelved to make room for our life together. A part of me ached to stay, to try to rebuild, but the truth was that the foundation we'd once stood on had been shaken to its core. I accepted the job. The next few weeks flew by in a blur of packing and goodbyes. Emily came over one last time to help sort through our things. We laughed, unexpectedly, over old photos, over souvenirs we'd collected on our trips, memories of the good times before everything had become so complicated. It felt bittersweet, a last grasp at the happiness we'd shared, but there was a comfort in it too, a sense of closure we both needed. When the day of my move finally arrived, she met me outside our apartment. We stood there, staring at each other in the quiet of the early morning, words hanging in the air. She stepped forward, hugging me tightly, and I could feel her tears on my shoulder. "I'll always be grateful for what we had," she whispered. "No matter what." "Me too," I replied, holding her close, letting the moment linger. I drove away, watching the city shrink in my rearview mirror, feeling the weight of a new life ahead of me. The journey wasn't easy. There were days I still thought about her, about the home we'd built, about the love we'd lost. But as time passed, I found myself settling into the rhythm of my new life. I made new friends, threw myself into my work, and slowly, I began to find parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. The memory of our marriage remained, like a faded photograph tucked away in a drawer. There were moments of regret, of wondering if we could have saved it, if things could have been different. But over time, those thoughts became gentler, more forgiving. I stopped blaming her, stopped blaming myself. Instead, I learned to see it as part of my story, a chapter that had ended, but one that had shaped me nonetheless. Years passed, and eventually, I heard that Emily had moved on too, that she'd found a new job, a new partner. I felt an odd peace hearing it, knowing she was happy, knowing that we both had been able to start over in our own ways. I sometimes think about that last night we talked, when everything lay bare between us, when we faced each other in the raw honesty we'd both avoided for so long. It hurt, but it freed us, forcing us to confront not only each other but ourselves. I carried that night with me, a reminder that even the deepest pain can lead to growth, that even the sharpest betrayal can teach us how to live with open eyes and open hearts. And now, as I look at my life, at the friendships I've formed, at the person I've become, I realize that letting go of Emily wasn't the end of my happiness. It was the beginning of a new understanding, of a path that I'd never have found had I not faced the truth. In the end, our story didn't have a happy ending, but it had an honest one. And for me, that was enough.